So, good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Mark Dincheko, and I'm at the University of Michigan. I'm very happy to host today's seminar. Today, we're very lucky to have Melissa Lee presenting her work. Let me make sure I get the title correct. From Pluribus to Unum, the Civil War and Imagined Sovereignty in 19th Century America. This is joint work with Nan Zhang of the Mannheim Center for European Social Research and Tilman Hirschenroder of Princeton University. And I should mention that Melissa is at Princeton University herself. So I'm going to turn it over to Melissa. But before I do, let me just remind the audience of the ground rules. Melissa is going to speak uninterrupted for 40 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes for questions. At that point, the formal seminar will end, but we will stick around for an additional 15 minutes if there are extra questions. In terms of questions, they can only be asked in the Q&A space. Please use the Q&A space, not the comment space. The only sorts of questions that may be allowed during the seminar would be legitimate clarification questions, and I'll have a look and see if that applies. And then afterwards, I'll gather the list of questions. I will unmute the speakers when appropriate and have the questioners, I should say, ask those questions. Okay, so I think that's it. Let me turn it over to Melissa. Welcome.
Hey, thank you so much for the introduction, Mark. I'm really delighted to be here and to present this work with my co-authors, Nan and Tilman. We've just completed a new round of revisions on the paper, and so this comes as excellent timing in terms of getting feedback on the project. Okay, so, okay, great. So this is a paper about imagined sovereignty. And as we know, one of the most important developments in the history of state formation is the emergence of sovereignty, or this idea that there exists a final political authority with the right to make and enforce binding rules over society. Now, while people no longer dispute whether that authority should exist, the configuration of that authority, that sovereign authority, has been fiercely contested. And so basically the questions that have been at stake over in that contestation is essentially where or in whom should sovereign authority be located? How should that sovereign authority be organized? Now, historically, violence has played a role in settling these debates. And so in wars over sovereignty, such as the English Civil War, one vision of how sovereign authority was to be organized triumphed over an alternative ideal and resulted in the institutionalization or preservation of the victor's vision. However, sovereign authority requires more than just institutions. It's more than a set of institutions, that is. It ultimately rests on the recognition and acceptance of the governed. So institutionalization alone does not automatically imply that acceptance will be forthcoming. And so in other words, sovereignty is fundamentally ideational. It exists when people think it exists. Okay. So what our paper does is it asks how warfare shapes the popular imagination of sovereignty. And so we explore three possible effects that differ in terms of how and for whom and when war can produce ideational shift. A A first possibility that we introduce in this paper is this idea of abandonment on the losing side. And so essentially the idea here is that losers reconcile themselves to the winner's vision of sovereignty and accept that vision. A second possibility is, rather than producing ideational convergence, there's a reinforcement effect, right? War hardens attachments to competing ideals on both sides through what we're going to call a normative valence effect. And a third possibility that we discuss in the paper, and I'm going to go through all of these in just a little bit, is this idea that war instead affects only a subset of the population, that it depends on what we call ideological entrepreneurs. And so we're going to call this effect the entrepreneurial hypothesis. And here the idea is basically these individuals are emboldened to seize the opportunity in the crisis of warfare to promote their own ideal of sovereignty. Now, we test the effects of warfare on imagined sovereignty in 19th century America. This is a case where the contest between two different visions of sovereignty erupted into the violence of the US Civil War. And one of the really neat things about this historical setting is that it provides a very long period to observe that contestation and the subsequent ideational transformation. However, this historical setting predates the advent of, say, public opinion data that would directly capture the degree to which individuals accept a particular vision of sovereign authority. And so to get around that problem, we exploit a grammatical shift that occurs in American English, in which the term United States stops being a plural noun and instead becomes a singular noun. So we take this shift. So for example, we used to say, or Americans used to say, the United States are, and now we say the United States is. And so we take this grammatical shift as indicative of a change in imagined sovereignty from the multiple equal sovereignties of the US states, the several states, to a shift toward the single final sovereignty embedded in the national government. So our analyses are going to reveal a very powerful Civil War effect. We do show that war shifts the popular imagination, but it does so only in the northern United States. And it's most pronounced among Northern Republicans, who we take as ideological entrepreneurs, right? These are the individuals, this is the group that's advocating for a single sovereignty embedded in the national government. Now, this finding and the project more broadly contributes to the literature on sovereignty and state development by really highlighting and emphasizing this ideational aspect of stateness. Much of the state building scholarship has emphasized the effect of war on the institutional development of the state, but as I've said earlier, institutions alone do not make a state. And so the institutional changes that come about from war do not necessarily produce ideational change. And that's a point that I want to pick up again in the conclusion. So given the novelty of our research question, we end up drawing on disparate literatures to formulate some theoretical conjectures. So there is no single body of work to which we are drawing from. Rather, we pull together different ideas from different literatures. What I want to do now is to give you the general version of our argument, and then I want to drill down into the specifics of the United States case to generate case-specific hypotheses that will guide our empirical analysis. So our first conjecture begins with this observation that war settles the institutional question. One side wins, one side loses, and the victors get to impose their institutions of sovereignty on the vanquished. And so given these facts on the ground, given military defeat and institutional imposition, the losing side may reconcile itself to this new reality. And so really what we're doing here is we're drawing parallels from the psychological and behavioral economics literature on adaptive preferences, in which people tend to adjust their aspirations to the possibilities, right? Institutional imposition and defeat change what is possible. And so here we really think that it's possible that the losing side will adjust themselves to the reality that they now face. And so basically our expectation here is that when defeat makes some institutional arrangements impossible, ideological abandonment will follow. So we're going to call this the abandonment hypothesis. A second conjecture draws instead on Charles Tilley's observation that wars are expensive in terms of blood and treasure. And so states draw on their population to get these resources, and leaders have to ask their citizens to sacrifice in times of war. And when leaders are communicating and speaking to their citizens in this way, they often explain why these wars are fought. They justify those sacrifices by making appeals, often in ideological terms. These can be appeals that are sort of patriotic in nature, they can be appeals that are religious in nature, but they can also be appeals to higher principles, like sovereignty principles. Sovereignty principles ranging from, say, the right to self-determination or so on. These appeals can and do take on normative valence, such that each side positions its principles as morally righteous, right? And so this appeal and justification process heightens the moral salience of the issues under dispute. And so we expect that under this hypothesis, which we're going to call the valence hypothesis, war strengthens ideological commitment on both sides. The third hypothesis takes inspiration from the scholarship that sees the disruption of war as an opportunity for institutional or ideational change. So here there's a bit of sort of parallels to how historical institutionalists might think of warfare, for example. Wars are, really moments of change. They're highly visible, highly violent, traumatic events, particularly civil wars. And for ordinary people, the uncertainty and shock of this kind of crisis disrupts their status quo and really opens them up to the possibility of conversion to new ideas. Now, knowing that these opportunities are rare, ideological entrepreneurs, by which we mean individuals most committed to promoting ideological change, can be newly energized and galvanized into action, right? This is sort of the, like jokingly, we call this the carpe diem hypothesis, but here we're going to call it the entrepreneurial hypothesis. It's really a sort of seize the moment kind of hypothesis. And our expectation here is that we expect to observe increased ideological commitment to sovereignty, but only among these ideologues, these ideological entrepreneurs. Now, as I mentioned, we examine the effects of war on imagined sovereignty in the context of 19th century America. We like this case for a variety of reasons. It features two clear competing visions of sovereignty that were in tension from the moment of America's founding. And so basically at our founding, our system was neither wholly federal nor wholly national. And this tension between the federal and national model, or the sort of more state-centric and more national model, is embedded in our founding documents. Now, debate about the location of final sovereign authority arose periodically throughout the first decades of the country's history. But North-South divisions over slavery really intensified that debate. Sometimes in this talk, I'm going to use the language of sectional divisions. That's just a way in the American political development literature of describing regions, right? So the North is one section and the South is the other section. In particular, the South justifies its position on slavery and its eventual secession from the Union by arguing that the Union was a compact of equal sovereign states. And so basically what they argued was that the individual sovereignty of the US states preceded the sovereignty of the Union, and that the Union only existed because the states were able to delegate some of this pre-existing sovereignty to the national government. And that authority, because it was final in the states, could ultimately be withdrawn. And so this is sort of an argument for why secession is legal. Now, in contrast, Northerners articulated a different vision. So their vision of sovereignty was much more organic and national in conception. Rather than this sort of composite sovereignty, for Northerners, the Union had what is called a consolidated sovereignty that arises from one people, not the several states. And so these views about composite sovereignty were especially pronounced among members of the Northern wing of the Republican Party. Now, as we know, eventually the Civil War was fought to settle the questions over slavery and the legality of secession. It settled these questions in an institutional sense, right? The South seceded, it formed the Confederacy, and the North fought back to preserve the Union, and it defeated the South. And so in our specific case, what we want to know is whether war promoted ideational shift and which of the mechanisms is responsible. Okay, so now that we have, sort of a basic historical background necessary, or basic historical background, I can then take the general versions of the arguments that I just gave you and derive case-specific hypotheses. And I'm summarizing them here in this table, that sort of the mechanism, their distinctiveness in terms of the timing of the ideational shift, where we expect to observe that shift and in what direction, right? So direction, again, remember the two poles of sovereignty are either the national sovereignty or the sovereignty embedded in the states, the states' rights version. So let's start with the abandonment hypothesis. If war kills off the losing side's ideal, then we expect this effect to manifest in the post-war period, right? Because it only occurs with defeat. And we expect to observe it among Southerners because these are the losers of the US Civil War. And we expect to observe that Southerners will abandon this principle of states' rights. And so we should see movement toward acceptance of that national sovereignty. The second hypothesis, again, is the valence hypothesis. Now, in the specifics of the US case, we actually have to develop two different versions of this hypothesis, a strong version and a weak version. Both versions have to exist to recognize that the sort of different starting positions in terms of why each side fought the war, right? So the strong version is basic. So let me back up. So as I said before, the South fought the Civil War to protect the institution of slavery. This is an issue on which many historians have consensus that it was about slavery, but that states' rights was used to justify the actions and to justify how the South protected its institution of slavery. And so here it's hard to think about the issues as taking on the same, as being equivalent to the way the North thought about the Civil War, which is really a fight to preserve the Union. And sort of belatedly, the Civil War became an opportunity to eradicate the institution of slavery for the North, right? Of course, the historiography here is quite complex, and we want to acknowledge that complexity by deriving these strong versus weak hypotheses. In the strong version, we expect, so in both versions, we expect the timing of the shift to occur at the outbreak of war, as both sides are justifying like why they are going to war. But in the way that we would distinguish the strong versus the weak version is via the targets and the direction of the effect, right? So the strong version would affect the South, and we should expect changes toward states' rights. That's going to be the way that we disentangle these two versions. And in the strong versus weak versions, we're not going to be able to do that. We're going to look instead at the North and look at movement toward national sovereignty, right? So this is really about divergence here, and in whom that divergence is occurring. Now, the last hypothesis is the entrepreneurial hypothesis. Again, we expect this to observe the effect at the outbreak of war, right? Because remember that these entrepreneurs are seizing the moment of the crisis of war, so we should expect to observe the effect sooner rather than later. Again, it differs from the earlier hypotheses in that it focuses only on a subset of individuals. In this case, the Northern Republican Party, who are the ideological entrepreneurs. And because they are pushing for sovereignty embodied in the national government, we should see change in the direction of greater acceptance of the national sovereignty. Okay, so, you know, one of the nice things about this case, as I mentioned, is that it gives us this long period to observe ideational shift. But one of the challenges that comes with that is trying to observe how people think about sovereignty, right? Like, what is the popular imagination of sovereignty? Given the lack of public opinion data, we have to develop a different way of trying to get into people's heads. But since we can't get into their heads, what we do is we look at how they speak. And the underlying idea here is basically how we speak is indicative, or can be taken as indicative of what we actually think. And so in other words, we use changes in the civic language as a window into the imagined sovereignty, right? So again, what we do is we leverage a grammatical shift within the American English, in which we have this shift away from the plural version of the United States are to the singular version of the United States is. So basically, we're going to take the plural version as excuse me, as being indicative of the idea that sovereignty resides in the several states. And we are going to take the singular version as indicative of the idea that sovereignty instead resides in the national government. Okay, So you might ask, is this actually a conceptually valid way of trying to capture the concept that we're interested in? And we're going to argue yes. We're going to argue yes on three different grounds. So first, we are not the very first scholars to identify that there is a grammatical shift, or to think that there is meaning in such shift. Historians have observed this shift before, and they attribute meaning in the grammar. So in other words, historians have observed that the shift does occur as a result of the Civil War, and they say that this shift corresponds to this idea of a nation, right? To this idea of sovereignty. Okay, so there's arguments from historians that we rely on. So secondly, 19th century observers themselves have argued that how you speak tells us something about what you think, right? So in the 19th century, especially in newspapers and popular debates, there's lots and lots of discussion about this idea that grammar corresponds to the idea of a nation. So for example, the Washington Post observed in 1887, the Washington Post had to write an editorial piece in which it was defending its choice of the singular use of the United States. And they wrote, there was a time a few years ago when the United States was spoken of in the plural number. Men said the United States are, but the war changed all that. So they observed that there is this shift, and that the shift corresponds with that of the Civil War. And basically they say in this quote that the grammar tells us something about what you think. I apologize for not actually having the full quote in front of me. But for us, the most persuasive piece of evidence about this that reassures us about the conceptual validity of this measure is basically the Confederacy, right? The Confederate States of America, the new government of the South, was never spoken of as a singular entity, right? So the Confederacy is plural. So we went through and we examined usages of the Confederacy as a plural noun or a singular noun, and it is always a plural noun. And we think that actually that makes a lot of sense because the Confederacy was fought and established on the idea of states' rights. So I can come back to conceptual validity if you're interested, but for now, I'd like to move forward. So basically what we're doing here, again, is we're going to try to identify the singular or plural, and we're going to look for it in text. We follow existing scholarship in the digital humanities by looking for the plural and singular via subject-verb agreement, right? So if a subject of a sentence, if the grammatical subject of a sentence is singular, it has to take a singular verb. And if the subject is plural, it's going to take a plural verb. And so we rely on this literature to identify three very common verb pairs. And that's going to be is, are, has, have, and was, were, okay? It's not straightforward to actually conduct this search, however. We can't just pull up a corpus of text, type in the United States is or the United States are. And the reason that it's difficult is we face two particular challenges with the text data. So first, the United States has to be the grammatical subject. So in other words, it cannot appear in the object position of the sentence. And when humans look at a sentence, it's very easy for us to recognize that whether or not the term United States appears in the subject or object position. But when you're doing it in sort of just text searches, you need a more sophisticated method of identifying it than just doing keyword searches, because keyword searches on their own will not be able to distinguish these two. And so an example of a non-subject mention it appears in this slide, and it says, the commissioners who represented the United States are now dead, right? This is an object, a mention, not a subject mention. So we have to get rid of those kind of mentions. The second challenge that we faced is really that the OCR data, so we're lucky that everything was already OCR'd, digitized, but these OCR data was not corrected. So what's known as dirty OCR. And so this is again a case where a human can tell immediately what the sentence says, or maybe with a little bit of effort, but a computer cannot, not without sort of more sophisticated approaches. And so an example of dirty OCR is in that second bullet point at the bottom, which says, what it's meant to say is, now the United States has not owned any land in that part of the state of Tennessee, right? So this is a grammatical subject mention, but if you had just done a keyword search, you would end up not recognizing it because it says United States. And so I'm happy to go over in great detail what we did to be able to address these issues. I do want to give huge amounts of credit to Tillman, who was my undergraduate research assistant turned co-author on this project for implementing a lot of that. So want to give him a shout out to that. So I'm again happy to talk to you about the details. Basically, we're going to throw out anything that's a prepositional mention. So there's certain structural features of American English where you can identify prepositions. We toss those out, and we program very flexible searches using regular expressions to identify mentions that look like the United States. We're going to look for those mentions using two types of textual sources. The first type is a set of newspaper data that come from two proprietary data sets. They cover the whole century, 1800 to 1899. What we like about this set of data is that the newspapers cover both political and non-political content. And this excellent coverage over the whole century is really going to be important for testing, first and foremost, the abandonment hypothesis, as well as the other hypotheses. But we really like sort of this corpus. The second set of textual data comes to us from congressional speech. The speech corpus only covers half the century for reasons I'll get into in a moment. But here, what we're basically doing is trading off breadth and obtaining depth, right? So we get analytical depth here because we can link speech, we can link grammatical usage to specific individuals. And that is going to be especially useful for adjudicating between the valence mechanisms and the emboldening or entrepreneurial mechanisms. And I'll get into that in just a moment. Given that our hypotheses, 2 of 3 of our hypotheses are about sectional variation, north-south variation, we're going to constrain attention to the states, the US states and their territorial predecessors that eventually fought in the Civil War. So this is a map of the United States at 1900. Don't worry so much about the counties in there. States that are in blue are entities that eventually fought for the Union. States that are in red fought for the Confederacy. And we're going to exclude everything in white. So these things are not in our sample. So that's largely the West that didn't participate in the Civil War. And we are going to exclude the states in gray. So that's Missouri, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky. These are what's known as the border states. These are states that had the institution of slavery, but did not join or were unable to join the Confederacy. In West Virginia's case in particular, they actually seceded from Virginia once Virginia seceded. So we're gonna throw out those 5 gray states. So what I wanna do now is actually dive into the data and show you what this looks like. So we begin by just examining sectional patterns in the newspapers visually. So what these plots show you is northern newspapers on the left in blue, southern newspapers on the right in red. You have year on the x-axis and the proportion of singular mentions on the y-axis. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to look at a grammatical subject mention. We're going to code whether or not that grammatical subject mention is singular. If it's singular, it's 1, then 0 otherwise. And so we're going to look, this plot is basically showing you the proportion of singular mentions in any given year. The yellow or gold bars in the middle are the years of the Civil War. And the size of the bubbles tell you how many observations we have in each of those years. And if you're wondering about the number of observations, the magnitude per year, the reason why the number is pretty small despite this excellent temporal coverage is that grammatical subject mentions are not super common. Right? So we have a hyper-specific way of identifying the singular and plural that relies on the grammatical subject. And it's just not a common structural feature in this time period of American English. So we have a lot of observations, but we don't have as many as you might expect. So I want to draw your attention to a couple of features of these plots. So basically, we do see an upward trend in the usage of singular, starting from the beginning of the century, going all the way to the end. At the beginning, hardly anyone said the United States are, or the United States have, right? But by the end, Americans are much more likely to use the grammatical singular. But there are sectional differences, and there are sectional differences that appear to coincide with the Civil War and that transformational moment. And so if you just sort of eyeball the graph, what you see is an acceleration of the adoption of the singular in the North and what appears to be no change in the South, right? It might be hard to see, but there does not appear to be strong evidence of an intercept shift during the time of the Civil War because these confidence intervals are crossing. Now, this provides, I think, some visual evidence against some of our initial hypotheses, but of course, we're now going to move to test this formally in a regression framework. Our main outcome of interest is going to be the change in slopes pre and post-war by region. I say main outcome because we're also going to, I want to confirm formally that there is no intercept shift, but our eyes tell us that there is going to be a slope shift, so that's our main outcome of interest. We're going to specify this as a triple interaction between section, again, north-south, period, pre and post-war, as well as year to be able to capture that time trend. The unit of analysis is a subject mentioned, and we're going to estimate this using a simple linear probability model with errors clustered by newspaper headquarter city. This gives us about 5,000 mentions with just under 5,000 unique documents. Now, one of the challenges, we confront a couple of challenges with respect to making inferences using this data. So of course, the first problem is the problem of confounders and being able to compare these newspaper observations with each other. In general terms, the confounders that we are concerned about come to us from the literature on modernization. And basically here we are drawing on literature about, say, urbanization, industrialization that can change individuals by disrupting or taking them out of their sort of more agrarian milieu and putting them in a new, more industrialized context, which changes their orientation away from their locality toward a national unit. And so here we want to rely on ideas about urbanization, contact with the state, industrialization, and so on. In the US context in particular, modernization tends to take the form of local political economy differences, right? An economy that is driven by manufacturing, largely the case in the North, versus economies that are driven much more by agriculture, the importance of agriculture, which differs depending on whether that's plantation agriculture or more sort of yeoman agriculture. But here the idea is basically that these local political economy differences shape local views about the proper location of US national authority, and they specifically manifest in debates about the role of the national tariff in protecting nascent American manufacturing, as well as what's called internal improvements in the American case, which is basically infrastructure to link up different parts of the country and take them out of their isolation. A second inferential, so we're going to code a bunch of variables using a bunch of cool data. I'm not going to go into them in detail because, spoiler alert, none of them matter. So I'm not going to spend time on that. Happy to take questions about it in Q&A. A second challenge that we face is actually trying to take a grammatical subject mentioned from a newspaper and locate it in an aerial unit, right? So to be able to code those confounders, like contact with the state, like manufacturing, or the role of the degree of urbanization, that requires putting a mention in a spatial unit. Now, these mentions are generated from newspapers that are headquartered in various cities, and we think about the relevant spatial unit as being the locality. Well, what's the locality? We're going to follow the literature and largely depend on the county. And a bunch of robustness checks, we're going to also create a separate aerial unit, which is the state. And so, for example, if the, say, Los Angeles Times were to have a grammatical subject mention, we're going to locate it in LA County in that year. The third consideration here is that newspaper content has to be locally generated. And so basically the way we do that is we're going to get around the tendency to reprint articles and instead rely on content that is likely to be local, such as letters to the editor and editorials. Now, given the complexity of what we're trying to analyze, rather than show you full regression plots or regression tables or coefficient tables, what we actually want to do is show you the linear combinations, the relevant linear combinations for our predictors of interest, right? And so I'm just going to summarize them to you rhetorically here. And where I want you to focus your attention is the change on that second line, 1866 minus 1865 change, that corresponds to the intercept shift from the graph. And I want you to focus your attention on that last line, the post minus pre 1866 trend. So again, remember the abandonment hypothesis has a timing expectation built into it. That's why we're going to code pre-post as 1866. And so again, the trend line is capturing the change in slope. And so this table confirms what our eyes saw. We're going to focus on the south because remember this abandonment hypothesis is about the south. We see no evidence of an intercept shift, and we have no evidence of a slope shift, right? So again, confirming what our eyes saw. So this basically suggests that there's no evidence for the abandonment hypothesis. So we're going to move along, and then we're going to test the valence hypothesis. So here, we're going to focus first on the strong version of the valence hypothesis. And again, the quantities of interest are that intercept shift and the slope shift. We're going to show you the results both by south and north. These are again linear combinations. These are not specific coefficients because the linear combinations are actually the quantities of interest. So in the south, again, no evidence of an intercept shift. No evidence of, oh, sorry, I should actually back up. We have to recode our data here because the valence hypothesis differs from the abandonment hypothesis in that the timing expectation is different, right? So abandonment is really like a post-war effect. The valence hypothesis, where each side sort of acquires normative valence and increased attachment to their ideological ideal, that we expect to observe close to, if not at the outset of war. And so we changed the pre-post variable to start at 1861. That's why this table reports 1861 minus 1860 changes. And again, the punchline is not a lot of evidence here. So if you focus on the slope shift and intercept shift, again, not a lot of evidence here for the South. What we do see is what appears to be confirming what we saw with our eyes for the North. Right, so no real evidence of intercept shift for the North, but a corresponding increase in the rate of adoption of the singular. So this is that last line in the table, post minus pre-1861 trend. So this is a statistically significant prediction, basically, again, confirming that there's an acceleration in the adoption of the singular. So let me just, again, summarize where we've been. Using the paper data, we looked at two of our case-specific hypotheses, what ended up being 4 versions. We find no evidence for the abandonment hypothesis, and we find no evidence for the strong version of the valence hypothesis. Now our task is actually to disentangle the weak version of the valence hypothesis, which focuses on the North as a section, and the entrepreneurial hypothesis, which focuses on ideological entrepreneurs within that section. To be able to disentangle these two hypotheses, which are otherwise similar in their observable implications, we need to go to the speech data. And that's again because we need to be able to identify the individuals who are using the grammatical singular. Now the speech data are super cool, but we also confront a number of inferential challenges here. The main challenge we had to confront was whether we can actually attribute speech to speakers. And prior to 1851, we cannot. And that is the reason why we lose data for the first half of the century. However, so I should say our speech data come from the journals of Congress. And so these journals were produced by reporters who would sit during the debates of Congress and record what was happening. Before 1851, these were summaries. But technological changes, particularly with respect to stenographic technology and the professionalizations of the Congressional Reporting Corps in the 1840s, basically allowed for verbatim transcription as of 1851. And so historians and Congress scholars treat these records of debates as verbatim as of 1851. So our analysis begins at 1851. Additionally, we're going to have to confront the entry and exit of speakers. So there's a couple of things going on here. So in this period of Congress is not super professionalized, by which I mean there's a lot of turnover. And so you only get the sort of individuals staying in Congress for long periods of time toward the end of the century. In addition, individuals can enter or exit our data set because they're contributing or not contributing grammatical subject mentions, right? So some years they may just not give a speech in which the United States appears in the grammatical subject position. On top of that, we confront an additional challenge, which is that, okay, so we have to be able to compare these individuals who are entering and exiting at different times. To make sure they're comparable, we're going to control for a bunch of things related to their life experience, such as whether they served in the military, where they were born, as well as the social milieu of where they grew up. And so we're going to code a bunch of controls. Spoiler alert, they also don't matter, and so I'm not going to spend time on them. The last thing that I want to mention that's an inferential challenge here is that speakers can exit in the South because the South secedes, right? So some of our analysis is going to be a bit noisier, particularly the time trend analysis, because we just don't observe congressional speech from the South when they are no longer in Congress. And when they come back, when they are readmitted to the Union after the end of the Civil War and after the end of the Civil War, the South was not free to elect its own representatives, right? So the presence of the federal army changed the type of people who are being elected to Congress. So we're going to treat some of this as noisy but suggestive. So again, we're looking for changes at the outset of war. So pre-post is going to be coded at 1861. And again, I'm looking for intercept shifts in singular usage, and I'm looking for time slope shifts, again, increasing adoption of the grammatical singular. We're going to conduct this analysis within the North only. For the first, we're going to conduct it only in the North because of this issue that I just mentioned with respect to the South. And we're going to compare Northern Whigs and Republicans. Whigs are the Republicans' predecessors who also sort of shared this national sovereignty attachment. We're going to compare them with Northern Democrats. So Northern Democrats are less attached. And so remember, we treat the Northern Republicans as ideological entrepreneurs. Democrats had much more ambivalent views about the national sovereignty. If the effects are the same for them, that would suggest that there is this more broad sectional effect, right, consistent with the valence hypothesis. If there are differential effects, and in particular, if we only see the effect in accelerated adoption among Republicans, that we take as evidence of the entrepreneurial effect. And that is, again, the main takeaway of this slide, right? So we're seeing changes really among the Northern Republicans and not the Northern Democrats. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead. Because of the sort of noise issues with respect to this data, we want to really make sure that our conclusions about the entrepreneurial hypothesis, these conclusions about the Republicans, can stand outside this data. And so our final test in this paper is to go back and use that newspaper data. Now, we can't observe partisanship in the newspaper data because we don't know the authors of this newspaper content, but we can observe how the areas or localities around the newspaper headquarters voted. And so basically the idea here is we want to know whether the followers of ideological entrepreneurs in places that tend to vote for them actually internalize the single sovereignty and adopt the grammatical singular faster. Again, we're going to observe voting behavior by focusing on a particularly important election that occurred after the start of the Civil War. That's the 1864 election between the Republican incumbent Abraham Lincoln and his Democratic challenger, George McClellan. And so our expectation here is that there's going to be if the entrepreneurial hypothesis is correct, we're going to observe a more rapid adoption of the grammatical singular among Lincoln counties, right? The counties that went for the Republicans, again, the Republicans being ideological entrepreneurs. And that's what we find here. So I, again, focus on the intercept shift and the slope shift. You'll observe that in both cases, there is actually an increase in the slope, both for the McClellan counties and the Lincoln counties. But notice that for the Lincoln counties, the effect is twice as large. And this is not so surprising because McClellan counties are not monoliths, right? There are Republicans in there. In combination with our previous speech analysis, we really do think this is actually evidence in favor of the entrepreneurial hypothesis. And so where we stand now is basically we've knocked out abandonment, we've knocked out both the strong and the weak versions of the valence hypothesis, and that leaves us with the entrepreneurial hypothesis. Now, just to conclude, we think this paper makes three main contributions. The first, especially for state building scholars like me, is really to recenter attention on the ideational aspects of stateness and sovereignty, and to show that there's such a mismatch between institutional and the institutional foundations and the ideational foundations. And for scholars, what this suggests is that we have to be careful drawing inferences about sovereignty by looking at institutions alone, right? If we think that sovereignty is ideational, we cannot just draw a straight line from institutional change to ideational change, at least not in the immediate aftermath of war. Our paper also makes a theoretical contribution by pointing to the role of ideological entrepreneurs in mediating the ideational effect of warfare. And beyond our study of the state, we can actually contribute to debates about the Civil War within the American studies literatures, and the American studies literatures in both history and in the in the humanities. And so basically we contribute evidence on the effect of the Civil War as a transformational moment, as the historians sort of cast it as, versus this longer run shift in how people conceive of America, as the more humanities oriented scholars argue. And we basically say it's both, right? Because there is a rapid shift. The Civil War is transformational, but it's only transformational for a subset. And for the rest of America, it is a much more gradual process of change. Just to conclude with some final implications for people who are interested in studying this effect of warfare and what happens after warfare, our paper suggests that national solidarity will be elusive in these kind of ideological contestations, right? And the North won, but the South did not come along, like not at least in an ideational sense. And what this suggests is that post-war governance is likely to be challenging, right? If the losers are not sort of at least quickly reconciling themselves to the winners, it's going to be very hard to govern. And that is exactly what we see in the United States case in Reconstruction and thereafter. So thank you so much for your attention, and I really look forward to your questions and comments.
All right, so many thanks to Melissa for such a creative paper, creative ideas and analyses. So just to remind everybody, please put your questions or a basic summary of your questions in the chat, and then we'll go from there. At the moment, the queue is open. Okay, so Nathan has a couple of questions. I also have a couple of questions, but why don't we have Nathan go first?
Well, thank you, Melissa, for a very interesting paper, very creative, I must say. And I have a couple of, maybe econometric or sort of more technical questions about the evidence, and one comment about the external validity or the policy implications of the paper. So in terms of the econometrics, so did you? I read through the paper, but I didn't see any reference to estimating this under the hypothesis there's a unit root in the series. The data speaks for itself. You can see the trends and everything, but controlling for unit roots could change the standard errors and the sort of all the types of inferences you're drawing from the differences in the slopes or intercepts, etc. So one question is whether you control for this, and that's a very technical question. Another one, which is more substantial, is so you presuppose that there is a north-south difference in these things, and you set up your dummies accordingly and according to this map. But did you do some kind of a placebo test where so you assign randomly states or other influential observations, say, I don't know, like Massachusetts driving this republic, whatever it is, the difference and not the rest of the union, because you pre-impose this north-south distinction, and so did you try estimating this with the individual states to see, or some subsets or some placebos? I mean, that would be very interesting to look at. And finally, a comment on the external validity. I mean, you draw these conclusions about civil wars, but but to the extent this conclusion could be carried on to national wars between two nations, that's, I think, a little bit more. So, it's, I would say this civil wars usually don't change perceptions of people within the country that much. And that I can agree with that, but I wouldn't extend it to sort of international wars in some sense. What happens to the national within an international, but that's just a comment on the externality. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for these questions. I'm going to take them in reverse order. So on the external validity question, we do think this is largely, but not exclusively, a Civil War story. Part of the reason is, so I think the nature of and disruptiveness of warfare is different in the external warfare case, right? And in some cases, especially from the American perspective, not all external wars are fought on your home territory. And I think that really changes some of these baseline assumptions we're making about the disruption and how people experience wars on the ground. Now, of course, that's a very American view, but I think it does suggest quite the need for a lot of caution in trying to generalize to these international wars. We do think maybe the broader logic of contestation can apply perhaps beyond the sovereignty context, right? So if you want to sort of really zoom out from what we are doing in this paper and just think about ideological contestation in warfare, we think that the sort of basic set of mechanisms could apply. You might think about ideological contestation in World War II, for example, right? Or which is not, I think, a contestation over sovereignty as we think about it in this paper. But we are very much more comfortable thinking about these arguments applying to civil war, at least with respect to sovereignty. Now, you asked about, I think, placebo tests and subsets of states driving the results. So here we really relied on the historiography to guide this north-south difference. We have not conducted analyses to see whether particular subsets of states or individual states are driving the results. We could do this, and I'm making a note to myself that we should do it. It's easier to do for the North than the South, just because the North is generating more observations, and so we'd be more confident given power considerations. The placebo tests that we have run so far are really changing the years of sort of changing when we set the cut point for pre-post. Again, like we don't really want to rely on just what our eyes see, but the sort of interocular test does suggest a strong sort of somewhere in the Civil War effect. And we've just confirmed that with placebos using dates far after the end of the Civil War. And so I will make a note to run these additional checks. Can you just quickly explain again what you asked me to control for, or whether I controlled for it, because it kind of cut out on my end when you asked the question?
Yeah, I mean, I was just suggesting to control for unit groups.
Okay, we have not done that.
Because your data is kind of a trend data.
Right.
And it affects the standard errors, etc. if you don't control for these. So I mean, it's just a control that needs to be done, I think.
I will put that on the list for the next round of revisions. Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple of people in the queue. Rui has his hand raised.
I do. Thanks very much, Melissa. I find this both fascinating and easy to relate to, since I currently live in the Confederacy that sort of survived historically precisely because they decided not to confront the idea of sovereignty, right? And so even today, the Swiss Confederacy is held together by the idea that sovereignty is clearly shared by the canton, but resides with the individual canton. So sort of the reverse story of what you were saying. So I have a few comments about perhaps the identification of your effect. So you mentioned modernization, but I didn't see anything about market integration. And of course, there's many ways of measuring market integration in terms of, covariance or co-movement of local prices, interest rates, and so on. So not only the infrastructure controls that you included, but the fact that some parts of the US, some subparts within the two sections were definitely much more integrated within themselves And some of them were actually more integrated with the rest of the world than others, right? So, starting with the South that had an economy that was exceptionally vented for export, right? So, and that could be, I'm sure you could find proxies to control for that as well. The other thing that got me thinking, so when did newspapers started controlling their own language? So today, at least major newspapers all have style books or style guides, right? And even if you write a letter to the newspaper, they'll reformat it to their own style guide. So what do historians of the printing press in the US say about this, right? Because that could affect, maybe, the effect you still measure it, it's there, but I wonder if this was really ideolational change, a change of ideology on the American public, or a change in the styles of these newspapers. And then the other thing, right? So this goes back to Nathan's previous question on external validity, right? So Europe, was famously built on almost constant warfare, frequently across national lines, religious and language lines, right? But the fact that nation states eventually collapsed definitely had to do with change of perceptions, what perhaps you call the abandonment hypothesis, right? Although there were many examples of ideological entrepreneurs that tried to side with the winning side, right? But many of this, or much of this, came through the educational system. And so I guess what I'm asking here is what happened to the educational system in reconstructed US South, right? Because, at least if you wait one generation, you would expect perhaps education to bring about the, what you're saying was a change of perceptions. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'll also go backwards in terms of the questions. So education enters into our thinking about this project in two different ways. So one is to distinguish between levels of education as reflected in the newspaper versus the congressional speech data. There's no question that congressional members of Congress are elites, and in this time period, many of them are highly educated. So earlier in the century, you could still get elected to Congress and might only have, sort of an education at home or like on your farm. By the time they enter our data set, that's less likely to be the case. And we think, so we can actually control for education directly. It doesn't have a predictive effect. So then you can think about education as it affects the newspaper data. And I think that's where we might expect a greater degree of heterogeneity. But one of the interesting things about American education is that there's, unlike, say, 19th century France, where there is great state interest in controlling education, education is not centrally directed. There is no national or even sort of clear regional curricula at this time. We can proxy for the degree of education in an area, and it doesn't have predictive power. And I think that's because education is going to pick up rather blunt effects rather than this question of whether the United States is a singular or plural noun. That was not a settled question, right? So it wasn't considered settled at the time. And so it's not something that I think would be, that would appear in, say, local textbooks at the time. So this question about Europe being built on constant warfare, of course, right? We've been struggling about how to think of the Napoleonic Wars in this context, right? The Napoleonic Wars are a series of wars that start to introduce this idea of sovereignty as residing in sort of people, at least to places that didn't have exposure to that before. Are these civil wars? Are these international wars? We're not really sure. And so again, like I think we don't yet have well-formed thoughts about how to take this to the European context with respect to the abandonment hypothesis. The other thing I should say is that we're looking for relatively, like, I wanted to zoom us back out to thinking about the plots that I showed you at the very beginning when I introduced the data, right? So like in the end, the United States, we do settle on this idea that the United States is singular. And so at some point there is some abandonment effect going on, but that abandonment effect does not appear to be linked to the war itself, or at least not that post-war moment. And so really it's the thing that we struggle with is how to interpret the continuation of a trend. So I don't have a good answer for you there. I also do not yet have a good answer about when newspapers start controlling their own language through the printing press. It's something on our to-do list to go look at. We really appreciate that suggestion. And we also appreciate the suggestion about market integration. My concern here, so I'm pretty sure we can get data on it. I worry a little bit about how, to what degree it's correlated with some of our sectional measures or state level measures. Like, for example, we do have manufacturing in our data set. We do have the importance of agriculture in our data set. It might give us some temporal variation that could be neat to play with, but at least cross-sectional or between variation, I think there is going to be a high degree of correlation. But should go check that, so we will. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so that marks the end of our formal session. It's been about 60 minutes. So what we're going to do now is take about, let's say, 12 to 14 minutes and move into the informal section where we can have further questions. So again, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Right now, we have one question from David Mitch, and then I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask. So I will just read David's question because it looks pretty straightforward here. And so the question is, can what you call the entrepreneurial hypothesis be put more crudely as insincere opportunism by politicians? Just wanted to clarify.
I think of it as opportunism, but I would not cast it, especially in this case, as insincere opportunism. The reason why I think it's not insincere is because the Republicans and their Whig predecessors were had already been promoting policies that would strengthen the national government. You can make an argument that this sort of urgency of sovereignty did not have. This was not sort of a high principled kind of way of thinking about it back then. They really were pursuing their local political economy interests, but the pursuit of those interests had significant implications for the expansion of national power. In addition, the slavery issue in the North gradually took on more urgency and a moral salience. And so for the radicals, especially within the Republican Party, this was a moment where they could really make possible the realization of the eradication of slavery. And they were true believers in that. And so at least in this case, I don't want to call it insincere. I think it's opportunism, but it's really backed by a set of interests and moral values that were sincerely held by the individuals in question.
Okay, excellent. So let me ask a couple of questions, and while we're waiting to see if others put some in the Q&A. So the first question builds off of some of what Nathan has said, some of what Rui has said, in part about civil wars versus interstate wars. Pardon me. And there's this paper that your talk got me thinking about. It's a recent paper by Alizina and co-authors on wars and nationalism and how wars can build a sense of a national identity. I just sent a link in the chat, but I would be curious to see how you think your work might relate to that. I mean, obviously not at this second, but maybe have a look at that paper if you haven't seen it yet. I didn't notice it's cited in yours. I think that might be interesting. And I think they focus more on external wars than internal wars.
Yeah. Do you want me? So on that point, we think that one of the things we were grappling with when we first started was whether R captures national identity or whether it captures attachments to sovereignty. And it took a while for us to convince ourselves that it was sovereignty, not identity, right? And so part of the reason why we think it is sovereignty and not identity is, let me see if I can actually pull up some quotes. Can I share my screen again? Is that still enabled?
Probably.
Can you see this?
Yes.
Yes. So in the United States, when people are talking about the grammar, they're not talking about it. They're talking about it much more in this sort of, are we a nation or are we a set of states? And I think that's slightly different than the like, are we Americans, right? Or are we Virginians, or are we Georgians, for example? That's this idea of being Georgian or being, like whether state or some local identity takes precedence. That's not the axis of dispute or in this country at that time, right? Sectional identity, absolutely, right? But this sort of where the plural is mapping onto multiple states. That is not what we're seeing in these kind of discussions. I really love this one about this guy, Colonel Milner, who's like a local dignitary, right? So he's going on about whether this should be separate states or not. And so we rely a bit on this qualitative evidence to interpret it much more in line with sovereignty rather than national identity. And so there, I think what this suggests, having not read that Alesina paper, is that the effect of war is going to have different effects on different outcomes. So maybe it builds identity, but it may not actually settle this question about, well, who should govern? Who gets that right to make and enforce binding rules? And I think this would also distinguish us from an earlier sort of less techie paper by Wimmer and his co-author, which looked at war and the nation state and sort of these various explanations. So there, like, it's hard to know what Wimmer means when he says nation state, but we do think it's separate again from both what it sounds like Alesina and his co-authors are working on and what we're doing here.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's an interesting distinction. And briefly following up on that, it'd be interesting to see when this sort of abandonment occurred in the South. I don't know if maybe the world wars mattered there, yeah. So the second question, I'll just try and be brief here, is, so you mentioned sacrifices in war, and that got me thinking a little bit about public goods and their provision. If sacrifice is required, you might think that you need to also give public goods as sort of like a reward for the sacrifice, or, to make the sacrifice seem fair in a way. And so I was just wondering how the provision of public goods after the war might, if there was much provision of public goods, might interact with the way people thought about sovereignty. So I guess I'd like to hear a little more about whether new public goods provision sort of played into this at all.
The way I would approach that question is to think about who benefits from public goods. So not public goods in sort of the strict economic sense, but actually who are those goods being directed to or toward. I bring this up partly because in the specific context of the United States, in the South, the Reconstruction era policies were really focused on trying to reverse and undo some of the horrific effects of slavery on Blacks, right? And so you get these sort of new Freedmen bureaus set up. I'm not such an expert on Reconstruction. I know that there are other scholars working on this topic, including, I think, Megan Stewart has a new paper on it. And so it's not obvious to me what kind of, I guess I would say, I don't know what kind of public goods are being directed toward the whites in the South versus the Blacks in the South versus, say, the individuals who actually fought in the war. Theda Scotchbull actually does have a paper on warfare and welfare after the US Civil War for veterans and mothers. And so political parties start to provide public goods in response to, they provide welfare assistance as sort of a way of competing for the votes of the veterans. This question of whether that changes sovereignty, I actually haven't thought about. So that's like a cool additional thing we can look at. I also mentioned the who for whom question because I'm doing separate work with a co-author, Gabriel Kohler-Derrick at Brown, soon to join the faculty at NYU Abu Dhabi, where we actually take up this question of for whom does warfare actually generate welfare? We look at that in the colonial context, in colonial French Algeria. As you might expect, actually, the sacrifices of citizens, colonial citizens, matter much more than the sacrifices of colonial subjects within the same colony. And this dovetails really nicely, but unfortunately, in a moral perspective, with what we know about the sacrifices of African Americans being recognized in wartime. And so again, I think that would suggest a different study looking at the heterogeneous effects between the marginalized and not marginalized and how they think about sovereignty. I don't think it's something that we can if you take those two things together and put them in our paper, I think it means that we need a different paper.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. No, it'd also be interesting. I think about that Sheevians to Stavage book about sort of wars and the sense of fairness, and that results in public goods provision. But I agree that this is really in the aftermath of World War II. But I agree that it's probably heterogeneous.
Right.
Who benefits from that?
Right. Right. And I think that's a really important question that we scholars should be attentive to.
Okay, let's see here. All right, so David Mitch asked another question. We have about 3 minutes. I know Melissa has to leave. So maybe I'll just read this one off. If Melissa feels she can give a quick answer. And then I think we should just wrap this up by thanking Melissa. So he says, what about rural versus urban differences in ideological attitudes, identity, etc.? Can this be addressed with the newspaper data, or was the readership of these largely urban in both the North and the South? And thanks to David for both his questions.
Yeah, it can actually be addressed in both data sets in the sense that we can construct a control for the degree of urbanization. So the way we do it is naturally different depending on the data set. So with the congressional speech data, we're really interested in the how the social and cultural milieu of the place where the Congress member grew up affects his beliefs, sort of on the assumption, and they're all him at this time period, but it basically, the assumption here is that sort of your formative experiences in your youth tend to stick with you over time. So there we locate where they grew up, where they were born, we put them in a county at that time, code the urbanization. I want to say that that actually might have weak predictive power. With the newspaper data, that is harder to draw inferences from with respect to the effect of urbanization, because the newspapers are headquartered in cities, right? And so what we're basically comparing more urbanized cities to less urbanized cities. And so we don't want to put a lot of stock on what that tells us about urbanization, right? Like, how should we compare the city of Raleigh pre-Civil War with the city of New York? Right. And it's not urban rule in the newspaper data. And so we're very hesitant to interpret the effect. Urbanization does actually happen to correlate very well with manufacturing, so in the newspaper data. And so we think it actually is picking up that. Thanks so much for the questions.
Yeah, so as we can see here, Melissa has this really fascinating, unique, and I already said creative, but I'll say it again, research agenda on state building. And we're really fortunate that Melissa could come today and share some of that with us. So let's all thank Melissa. And I think on that note, we will end things. So we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. And thanks so much for the engagement.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you very much. Thank you. See you.
Great paper.